All right, we are coming up on 8 o'clock, and my camera decided that now would be a wonderful time to fizzle out. Wouldn't you know? All right, yep, so we are coming up on 8 o'clock, and we are ready to get back into the Red Badge of Courage. So, settle in, grab yourself a book, grab a drink, make sure a cat is nearby. We always need those. And let's dive back in. As I had said, welcome back. This is our third and probably final night reading The Red Badge of Courage by Stephen Crane. We've followed along with Henry's misadventures as he wandered first through the hellscape of his own immature but mature mind, as he decided whether or not he was a coward. And then on the day of battle, we found that maybe indeed. But through some serendipitous chance, he was bludgeoned across the head. Which usually you don't thank your lucky stars for, but we'll give Henry a pass for this one. And then found a helpful soldier that helped him meander through the camp and be reunited with his regiment. Among whom he found that, you know what, about half of the regiment had wandered off. Either been killed in action, which is understandable, this is war, or done like Henry did and skedaddled. But most of those came back. So maybe it's not so unusual that poor Henry has a little bit of a yellow streak. It could happen to anybody. I certainly couldn't say that I wouldn't bolt at the first sign of action like that. And he did make it through the first skirmish. It was the second that broke him and most of his friends. So, let's go ahead and see what we have still in store for our I guess he's not the bottom Henry. He's at least our second favorite, or he's at least second from the bottom of our list of Henrys, because there is just something unfortunate about the name, isn't there? We've got Henry David Thoreau. We've got this Henry. They're just kind of unlikable. I don't know what it is. I think you're right. I think we are still at two Henrys. So he's doing well. He's not. He is our favorite Henry. Unfortunately, that does mean that Henry David is our second favorite Henry, and that has implications. Maybe we need to find more Henrys. Or maybe we just bury this and forget all about this conversation. I could go either way, really. Alright, let's go ahead and get back into the book, because we have about a third of it to get through tonight, and there's only so much time if we keep yapping. So, let's resume now with Chapter 15 of The Red Badge of Courage. The regiment was standing at order, arms at the side of the lane, waiting for the command to march, when, suddenly, my camera died. Thank you very much. I do believe that it is probably the camera itself, rather than my USBs. I should hope, anyway. So, the search for a camera will resume before long, I'm sure. The regiment was standing at order arms at the side of a lane, waiting for the command to march, when suddenly the youth remembered the little packet, and wrapped in a faded yellow envelope, which the loud young soldier with lugubrious words had entrusted to him. It made him start. He uttered an exclamation and turned toward his comrade. "Wilson!" "What?" His friend, at his side in the ranks, was thoughtfully staring down the road. From some cause, his expression was, at that moment, very meek. The youth, regarding him with sidelong glances, felt impelled to change his purpose. "Oh, nothing," he said. His friend turned his head in some surprise. "Why? What was you going to say?" "Oh, nothing," repeated the youth. He resolved not to deal the little blow. It was sufficient that the fact made him glad. It was not necessary to knock his friend on the head with the misguided packet. He had been possessed of much fear of his friend, for he saw how easily questionings could make holes in his feelings. Lately he had assured himself that the altered comrade would not tantalize him with a persistent curiosity. But he felt certain that during the first period of leisure his friend would ask him to relate his adventures of the previous day. He now rejoiced in the possession of a small weapon, with which he could prostrate his comrade at the first signs of a cross-examination. He was master. It would now be he who could laugh and shoot the shafts of derision. The friend had, in a weak hour, spoken with sobs of his own death. He had delivered a melancholy oration previous to his funeral, and had doubtless, in the packet of letters, presented various keepsakes to relatives. But he had not died, and thus he had delivered himself into the hands of the youth. Henry's kind of an asshole. The latter felt immensely superior to his friend, but he inclined to condescension. He adopted toward him an air of patronizing good humor. His self-pride was now entirely restored. In the shade of its flourishing growth, he stood with braced and self-confident legs, and since nothing could now be discovered, he did not shrink from an encounter with the eyes of judges, and allowed no thoughts of his own to keep him from an attitude of manfulness. He had performed his mistakes in the dark, and so he was still a man. Indeed, when he remembered his fortunes of yesterday, and looked at them from a distance, he began to see something fine there. He had license to be pompous and veteran-like. His panting agonies of the past he put out of his sight. In the present, he declared to himself that it was only the doomed and the damned who roared with sincerity at circumstance. Few but they ever did it. A man with a full stomach and the respect of his fellows had no business to scold about anything that he might think to be wrong in the ways of the universe, or even with the ways of society. Let the unfortunates rail. The others may play marbles. He did not give a great deal of thought to these battles that lay directly before him. It was not essential that he should plan his ways in regard to them. He had been taught that many obligations of life were easily avoided. The lessons of yesterday had been that retribution was a laggard and blind. With these facts before him, he did not deem it necessary that he should become feverish over the possibilities of the ensuing 24 hours. He could leave that much to chance. Besides, a faith in himself had secretly blossomed. There was a little flower of confidence growing within him. He was now a man of experience. He had been out among the dragons, he said, and he assured himself that they were not so hideous as he had imagined them. Also, they were inaccurate. They did not sting with precision. A stout heart often defied, and defying, escaped. And furthermore, how could they kill him, who was the chosen of gods and doomed to greatness? He remembered how some of the men had run from the battle. As he recalled their terror-struck faces, he felt a scorn for them. They had surely been more fleet and more wild than was absolutely necessary. They were weak mortals. As for himself, he had fled with discretion and dignity. He was aroused from his reverie by his friend, who, having hitched about nervously and blinked at the trees for a time, suddenly coughed in an introductory way and spoke. "Fleming!" "What?" I suppose Fleming is our Henry's last name. It'll be good to remember that one, because little Henry Fleming is quickly falling in my esteem. The friend put his hand up to his mouth and coughed again. He fidgeted in his jacket. "Well," he gulped at last, "I guess you might as well give me back them letters." Dark, prickling blood had flushed into his cheeks and brow. "All right, Wilson," said the youth. He loosened 2 buttons of his coat, thrust in his hand, and brought forth the packet. As he extended it to his friend, the latter's face was turned from him. He had been slow in the act of producing the packet, because, during it, he had been trying to invent a remarkable comment on the affair. He could conjure up nothing of sufficient point. He was compelled to allow his friend to escape unmolested with his packet, and for this he took unto himself considerable credit. It was a generous thing. His friend at his side seemed suffering great shame. As he contemplated him, the youth felt his heart grow more strong and stout. He had never been compelled to blush in such a manner for his acts. He was an individual of extraordinary virtues. He reflected with condescending pity. Too bad, too bad. The poor devil makes him feel tough. After this incident, as he reviewed the battle pictures he had seen, he felt quite competent to return home and make the hearts of the people glow with stories of war. He could see himself in a room of warm tints, telling tales to listeners. He could exhibit laurels. They were insignificant. Still, in a district where laurels were infrequent, they might shine. He saw his gaping audience picturing him as the central figure in blazing scenes. And he imagined the consternation and the ejaculations of his mother and the young lady at the seminary as they drank his recitals, their vague feminine formula for beloved ones doing brave deeds on the field of battle without risk of life would be destroyed. Yeah, Henry, young Mr. Fleming, we're gonna have to have a talk, lad. Alright, that is the end of chapter 15. And let's carry on to chapter 16. A sputtering of musketry was always to be heard. Later, the cannon had entered the dispute. In the fog-filled air, their voices made a thudding sound. The reverberations were continual. This part of the world led a strange, battleful existence. The youth's regiment was marched to relieve a command that had lain long in some damp trenches. The men took positions behind a curving line of rifle pits that had been turned up, like a large furrow, along the line of woods. Before them was a level stretch, peopled with short, deformed stumps. From the woods beyond came the dull popping of the skirmishers and pickets, firing in the fog. From the right came the noise of a terrific fracas. The men cuddled behind the small embankment and sat in easy attitudes awaiting their turn. Many had their backs to the firing. The youth's friend lay down, buried his face in his arms, and almost instantly, it seemed, he was in a deep sleep. The youth leaned his breast against the brown dirt and peered over at the woods and up and down the line. Curtains of trees interfered with his ways of vision. He could see the low line of trenches, but for a short distance. A few idle flags were perched on the dirt hills. Behind them were rows of dark bodies, with a few heads sticking curiously over the top. Always, the noise of skirmishers came from the woods on the front and left, and the din on the right had grown to frightful proportions. The guns were roaring, without an instant's pause for breath. It seemed that the cannon had come from all parts and were engaged in a stupendous wrangle. It became impossible to make a sentence heard. The youth wished to launch a joke, a quotation from newspapers. He desired to say, "All quiet on the Rappahannock," but the guns refused to permit even a comment upon their uproar. He never successfully concluded the sentence, but at last the guns stopped, and among the men in the rifle pits rumors again flew like birds. But they were now, for the most part, black creatures who flapped their wings drearily near to the ground and refused to rise on any wings of hope. The men's faces grew doleful from the interpreting of omens. Tales of hesitation and uncertainty on the part of those high in place and responsibility came to their ears. Stories of disaster were borne into their minds with many proofs. This din of musketry on the right, growing like a released genie of sound, expressed and emphasized the army's plight. The men were disheartened and began to mutter. They made gestures expressive of the sentence, "Ah, what more can we do?" And it could always be seen that they were bewildered by the alleged news and could not fully comprehend a defeat. Before the gray mists had been totally obliterated by the sun rays, the regiment was marching in a spread column that was retiring carefully through the woods. The disordered, hurrying lines of the enemy could sometimes be seen down through the groves and little fields. They were yelling, shrill and exultant. At this sight, the youth forgot many personal matters and became greatly enraged. He exploded in loud sentences. "But Jiminy, we're generaled by a lot of lunkheads." "More than one feller has said that today," observed a man. His friend, recently aroused, was still very drowsy. He looked behind him until his mind took in the meaning of the movement. Then he sighed. "Oh, well, suppose we got licked," he remarked sadly. The youth had a thought that it would not be handsome for him to freely condemn other men. He made an attempt to restrain himself, but the words upon his tongue were too bitter. He presently began a long and intricate denunciation of the commander of the forces. "Maybe it wasn't all his fault, not altogether. He did the best he knowed. It's our luck to get licked often," said his friend in a wary tone. He was trudging along with stooped shoulders and shifting eyes, like a man who has been caned and kicked. "Well, don't we fight like the devil? Don't we do all that men can?" demanded the youth loudly. He was secretly dumbfounded at this sentiment when it came from his lips. For a moment, his face lost its valor, and he looked guiltily about him, but no one questioned his right to deal in such words. And presently, he recovered his air of courage. He went on to repeat a statement he had heard going from group to group at the camp that morning. "The brigadier said he never saw a new regiment fight the way we fought yesterday, didn't he? And we didn't do better than another regiment, did we? Well then, you can't say it's the army's fault, can you?" In his reply, the friend's voice was stern. "Of course not," he said. "No man dare say we don't fight like the devil. No man will ever dare say it. The boys fight like hell roosters, but still, we don't have no luck." "Well then, if we fight like the devil and don't ever whip, it must be the general's fault," said the youth grandly and decisively. "And I don't see any sense in fighting and fighting and fighting, yet always losing through some darned old lunkhead of a general." A sarcastic man who was tramping at the youth's side then spoke lazily. "Maybe you think you fit the whole battle yesterday, Fleming," he remarked. The speech pierced the youth. Inwardly, he was reduced to an abject pulp by these chance words. His legs quaked privately. He cast a frightened glance at the sarcastic man. "Why, no," he hastened to say in a conciliating voice. "I don't think I fought the whole battle yesterday." But the other seemed innocent of any deeper meaning. Apparently he had no information. It was merely his habit. "Oh," he replied in the same tone of calm derision. The youth, nevertheless, felt a threat. His mind shrank from going near to the danger, and thereafter he was silent. The significance of the sarcastic man's words took from him all loud moods that would make him appear prominent. He became suddenly a modest person. There was low-toned talk among the troops. The officers were impatient and snappy, their countenances clouded with the tales of misfortune. The troops, sifting through the forest, were sullen. In the youth's company, once a man's laugh rang out. A dozen soldiers turned their faces quickly toward him and frowned with vague displeasure. The noise of firing dogged their footsteps. Sometimes it seemed to be driven a little way, but it always returned again with increased insolence. The men muttered and cursed, throwing black looks in its direction. In a clear space, the troops were at last halted. Regiments and brigades, broken and detached through their encounters with thickets, grew together again, and lines were faced toward the pursuing bark of the enemy's infantry. This noise, following like the yelpings of eager metallic hounds, increased to a loud and joyous burst, and then, as the sun went serenely up the sky, throwing illuminating rays into the gloomy thickets, it broke forth into prolonged pealings. The woods began to crackle as if afire. "Whoop-a-da-dee," said a man. "Here we are, everybody fighting, blood and destruction." "I was willing to bet they'd attack as soon as the sun got fairly up," savagely asserted the lieutenant, who commanded the youth's company. He jerked without mercy at his little mustache. He strode to and fro with dark dignity in the rear of his men, who were lying down behind whatever protection they had collected. A battery had trundled into position in the rear, and was thoughtfully shelling the distance. The regiment, unmolested as yet, awaited the moment when the gray shadows of the woods before them should be slashed by the lines of flame. There was much growling and swearing. "Good God!" the youth grumbled. "We're always being chased around like rats. It makes me sick. Nobody seems to know where we go or why we go. We just get fired around from pillar to post and get licked here and get licked there, and nobody knows what it's done for. It makes a man feel like a damn kitten in a bag. Now, I'd like to know what the eternal thunders we was marching to these woods for anyhow, unless it was to give the Rebs a regular pot shot at us. We came in here and got our legs all tangled up in these cussed briars, and then we began to fight, and the Rebs had an easy time of it. Don't tell me it's just luck. I know better. It's this darned old..." The friend seemed jaded, but he interrupted his comrade with a voice of calm confidence. It'll turn out all right in the end," he said. "Oh, the devil it will. You almost talk like a dog-hanged person. Don't tell me. I know." At this time there was an interposition by the savage-minded lieutenant, who was obliged to vent some of his inward dissatisfaction upon his men. "You boys shut up. There's no need of your wasting your breath in long-winded arguments about this and that and the other. You've been jawing like a lot of old hens. All you got to do is to fight, and you'll get plenty of that to do in about 10 minutes. Less talking and more fighting is what's best for you boys. I never saw such gabbling jackasses." He paused, ready to pounce upon any man who might have the temerity to reply. No words being said, he resumed his dignified pacing. "There's too much chin music and too little fighting in this war anyhow," he said to them, turning his head for a final remark. The day had grown more white, until the sun shed his full radiance upon the thronged forest. A sort of a gust of battle came sweeping toward that part of the line where lay the youth's regiment. The front shifted a trifle to meet it squarely. There was a wait. In this part of the field, there passed slowly the intense moments that precede the tempest. A single rifle flashed in a thicket before the regiment. In an instant, it was joined by many others. It was a mighty song of clashes and crashes that went sweeping through the woods. The guns in the rear, aroused and enraged by shells that had been thrown burr-like at them, suddenly involved themselves in a hideous altercation with another band of guns. The battle roar settled to a rolling thunder, which was a single long explosion. In the regiment, there was a peculiar kind of hesitation denoted in the attitudes of the men. They were worn, exhausted, having slept but little and labored much. They rolled their eyes toward the advancing battle as they stood awaiting the shock. Some shrank and flinched. They stood as men tied to stakes. And that is the end of chapter 16. So, as anybody who has something to hide, Henry is talking way too much to try and gloss things over a little bit. We know what this is about. Whether or not the rest of them are onto his schemes, that's entirely another man's guess. But for now, we know that Henry is full of shit. All right, so let's see. We've got making pretty decent progress so far. So let's carry this on with chapter 17. Actually, before we go on, I do want to see how many chapters we have left. Okay, so there's 24 chapters altogether, so we've got a fair bit yet. This advance of the enemy had seemed to the youth like a ruthless hunting. He began to fume with rage and exasperation. He beat his foot upon the ground and scowled with hate at the swirling smoke that was approaching like a phantom flood. There was a maddening quality in this seeming resolution of the foe to give him no rest, to give him no time to sit down and think. Yesterday, he had fought and fled rapidly. There had been many adventures. For today, he felt that he had earned opportunities for contemplative repose. He could have enjoyed portraying to uninitiated listeners various scenes at which he had been a witness or ably discussing the processes of war with other proved men. Too, it was important that he should have time for physical recuperation. He was sore and stiff from his experiences. He had received his fill of all exertions, and he wished to rest. But those other men seemed never to grow weary. They were fighting with their old speed. He had a wild hate for the relentless foe. Yesterday, when he had imagined the universe to be against him, he had hated it. Little gods and big gods. Today he hated the army of the foe with the same great hatred. He was not going to be badgered of his life like a kitten chased by boys, he said. It was not well to drive men into final corners. At those moments, they could all develop teeth and claws. He leaned and spoke into his friend's ear. He menaced the words with a gesture. If they keep on chasing us, by God, they better watch out. Can't stand too much. The friend twisted his head and made a calm reply. If they keep on chasing us, they'll drive us all into the river. The youth cried out savagely at this statement. He crouched behind a little tree, with his eyes burning hatefully and his teeth set in a cur-like snarl. The awkward bandage was still about his head, and upon it, over his wound, there was a spot of dry blood. His hair was wondrously tousled, and some straggling moving locks hung over the cloth of the bandage, down toward his forehead. His jacket and shirt were open at the throat, and exposed his young bronzed neck. There could be seen spasmodic gulpings at his throat. His fingers twined nervously about his rifle. He wished that it was an engine of annihilating power. He felt that he and his companions were being taunted and derided from sincere convictions that they were poor and puny. His knowledge of his inability to take vengeance for it made his rage into a dark and stormy specter that possessed him and made him dream of abominable cruelties. The tormentors were flies sucking insolently at his blood, and he thought that he would have given his life for a revenge of seeing their faces in pitiful plights. The winds of battle had swept all about the regiment, until the one rifle, instantly followed by others, flashed in its front. A moment later, the regiment roared forth its sudden and valiant retort. A dense wall of smoke settled down. It was furiously slit and slashed by the knife-like fire from the rifles. To the youth, the fighters resembled animals tossed for a death struggle into a dark pit. There was a sensation that he and his fellows at bay were pushing back, always pushing fierce onslaughts of creatures who were slippery. Their beams of crimson seemed to get no purchase upon the bodies of their foes. The latter seemed to evade them with ease, and come through, between, around, and about with unopposed skill. When, in a dream, it occurred to the youth that his rifle was an impotent stick, he lost sense of everything but his hate, his desire to smash into pulp the glittering smile of victory which he could feel upon the faces of his enemies. The blue smoke-swallowed line curled and writhed like a snake stepped upon. It swung its ends to and fro in agony of fear and rage. The youth was not conscious that he was erect upon his feet. He did not know the direction of the ground. Indeed, once he even lost the habit of balance and fell heavily. He was up again immediately. One thought went through the chaos of his brain at the time. He wondered if he had fallen because he had been shot. But the suspicion flew away at once. He did not think more of it. He had taken up a first position behind the little tree, with a direct determination to hold it against the world. He had not deemed it possible that his army could that day succeed, and from this he felt the ability to fight harder. But the throng had surged in all ways until he lost directions and locations, save that he knew where lay the enemy. The flames bit him, and the hot smoke broiled his skin. His rifle barrel grew so hot that ordinarily he could not have borne it upon his palms. But he kept on stuffing cartridges into it, and pounding them with his clanking, bending ramrod. If he aimed at some changing form through the smoke, he pulled the trigger with a fierce grunt, as if he were dealing a blow with a fist with all his strength. When the enemy seemed falling back before him and his fellows, he went instantly forward, like a dog who, seeing his foes lagging, turns and insists upon being pursued. And when he was compelled to retire again, he did it slowly, sullenly, taking steps of wrathful despair. Once he, in his intent hate, was almost alone, and was firing, when all those near him had ceased. He was so engrossed in his occupation that he was not aware of a lull. He was recalled by a hoarse laugh and a sentence that came to his ears in a voice of contempt and amazement. "You infernal fool! Don't you know enough to quit when there ain't anything to shoot at? Good God!" He turned then, and pausing, with his rifle thrown half into position, looked at the blue line of his comrades. During this moment of leisure, they seemed to all be engaged in staring with astonishment at him. They had become spectators. Turning to the front again, he saw, under the lifted smoke, a deserted ground. He looked bewildered for a moment. Then there appeared, upon the glazed vacancy of his eyes, a diamond point of intelligence. "Oh," he said, comprehending. He returned to his comrades and threw himself upon the ground. He sprawled like a man who had been thrashed. His flesh seemed strangely on fire, and the sounds of the battle continued in his ears. He groped blindly for his canteen. The lieutenant was crowing. He seemed drunk with fighting. He called out to the youth, "By heavens! If I had 10,000 wildcats like you, I could tear the stomach out of this war in less than a week." He puffed out his chest with a large dignity as he said it. Some of the men muttered and looked at the youth in awestruck ways. It was plain that, as he had gone on loading and firing and cursing without proper intermission, they had found time to regard him, and they now looked upon him as a war devil. The friend came staggering to him. There was some fright and dismay in his voice. "Are you all right, Fleming? Do you feel all right? Right? Nothing the matter with you, Henry, is there?" "No," said the youth with difficulty. His throat seemed full of knobs and burrs. These incidents made the youth ponder. It was revealed to him that he had been a barbarian, a beast. He had fought like a pagan who defends his religion. Regarding it, he saw that it was fine, wild, and in some ways easy. He had been a tremendous figure, no doubt. By this struggle, he had overcome obstacles which he had admitted to be mountains. They had fallen like paper peaks, and he was now what he called a hero. And he had not been aware of the process. He had slept, and awakening, found himself a knight. He lay and basked in the occasional stares of his comrades. Their faces were varied in degrees of blackness from the burned powder. Some were utterly smudged. They were reeking with perspiration, and their breaths came hard and wheezing. And from these soiled expanses they peered at him. "Hot work, hot work!" cried the lieutenant deliriously. He walked up and down, restless and eager. Sometimes his voice could be heard in a wild, incomprehensible laugh. When he had a particularly profound thought upon the science of war, he always unconsciously addressed himself to the youth. There was some grim rejoicing by the men. "By thunder, I bet this army will never see another new regiment like us." "You bet." "A dog, a woman, and a walnut tree. The more you beat 'em, the better they be. That's like us." "Lost a pile of men, they did. If an old woman swept up the woods, she'd get a dustpanful." "Yes, if she'll come around again in about an hour, she'll get a pile more." The forest still bore its burden of clamor. From off under the trees came the rolling clatter of the musketry. Each distant thicket seemed a strange porcupine with quills of flame. A cloud of dark smoke, as from smoldering ruins, went up toward the sun, and now bright and gay in the blue enameled sky. That brings us to the end of chapter 17. So, lad found a little bit of berserker strength in him. He wasn't really aware of himself, so you can't really call it courage. He just sort of shut down and got really, really pissy. And wouldn't you know, he got lucky, didn't get killed, and now he's the hero and rumor of his own imagination, and it's being puffed up a little bit by his friends and the lieutenant there. So, I'm sure it won't get to his head, right? Henry is much too big of a person to let that get to him, right? Yeah, I'm sure that'll happen very quickly. All right, so let's continue on. We can get through another chapter or two before we take a break here. So, we've got chapter 18. The ragged line had respite for some minutes, but during its pause, the struggle in the forest became magnified until the trees seemed to quiver from the firing and the ground to shake from the rushing of men. The voices of the cannon were mingled in a long and interminable row. It seemed... I think it was row, yeah. The voices of the cannon were mingled in a long and interminable row. It seemed difficult to live in such an atmosphere. The chests of the men strained for a bit of freshness, and their throats craved water. There was one shot through the body, who raised a cry of bitter lamentation when came this lull. Perhaps he had been calling out during the fighting also, but at that time no one had heard him. But now the men turned at the woeful complaints of him upon the ground. Who is it? Who is it? It's Jimmy Rogers. Jimmy Rogers. When their eyes first encountered him, there was a sudden halt, as if they feared to go near. He was thrashing about in the grass, twisting his shuddering body into many strange postures. He was screaming loudly. This instant's hesitation seemed to fill him with a tremendous, fantastic contempt. He damned them in a shrieked sentences. The youth's friend had a geographical illusion concerning a stream. And he obtained permission to go for some water. Immediately, canteens were showered upon him. "Fill mine, will you? Bring me some too, and me too." He departed, ladened. The youth went with his friend, feeling a desire to throw his heated body into the stream and, soaking there, drink quarts. They made a hurried search for the supposed stream, but did not find it. "No water here," said the youth. They turned without delay and began to retrace their steps. From their position, as they again faced toward the place of the fighting, they could comprehend a greater amount of the battle than when their visions had been blurred by the hurling smoke of the line. They could see dark stretches widening along the land, and on one cleared space there was a row of guns making gray clouds, which were filled with large flashes of orange-colored flame. Over some foliage, they could see the roof of a house. One window, glowing a deep murder red, shone squarely through the leaves. From the edifice, a tall, leaning tower of smoke went far into the sky. Looking over their own troops, they saw mixed masses, slowly getting into regular form. The sunlight made twinkling points of the bright steel. To the rear, there was a glimpse of a distant roadway as it curved over a slope. It was crowded with retreating infantry. From all the interwoven forest arose the smoke and bluster of the battle. The air was always occupied by a blaring. Near where they stood, shells were flip-flapping and hooting. Occasional bullets buzzed in the air and spanged into tree trunks. Wounded men and other stragglers were slinking through the woods. Looking down an aisle of the grove, the youth and his companion saw a jangling general and his staff almost ride upon a wounded man who was crawling on his hands and knees. The general reined strongly at his charger's opened and foamy mouth and guided it with dexterous horsemanship past the man. The latter scrambled in wild and torturing haste. His strength evidently failed him as he reached a place of safety. One of his arms suddenly weakened, and he fell, sliding over upon his back. He lay stretched out, breathing gently. A moment later, the small, creaking cavalcade was directly in front of the two soldiers. Another officer, riding with the skillful abandon of a cowboy, galloped his horse to a position directly before the general. The two unnoticed foot soldiers made a little show of going on, but they lingered near in the desire to overhear the conversation. Perhaps, they thought, some great inner historical things would be said. The general, whom the boys knew as the commander of their division, looked at the other officer and spoke coolly, as if he were criticizing his clothes. "The enemy's forming over there for another charge," he said. "It'll be directed against Whiteside, and I fear they'll break through unless we work like thunder to stop 'em." The other swore at his restive horse, and then cleared his throat. He made a gesture toward his cap. "It'll be hell to pay stopping them," he said shortly. "I presume so," remarked the general. Then he began to talk rapidly and in a lower tone. He frequently illustrated his words with a pointing finger. The two infantrymen could hear nothing until finally he asked, "What troops can you spare?" The officer, who rode like a cowboy, reflected for an instant. "Well," he said, "I had to order in the 12th to help the 17th or 76th, and I haven't really got any. But there's a 304th. They fight like a lot of mule drivers. I can spare them best of any." The youth and his friend exchanged glances of astonishment. The general spoke sharply. "Get 'em ready, then. I'll watch deployments from here, and send you word when to start 'em. It'll happen in 5 minutes. As the other officer tossed his fingers toward his cap and, wheeling his horse, started away, the general called out to him in a sober voice, "I don't believe many of your mule drivers will get back." The other shouted something in reply. He smiled. With scared faces, the youth and his companion hurried back to the line. These happenings had occurred an incredibly short time, or had occupied an incredibly short time, yet the youth felt that, in them, he had been made aged. New eyes were given to him, and the most startling thing was to learn suddenly that he was very insignificant. The officer spoke of the regiment as if he referred to a broom. Some part of the woods needed sweeping, perhaps, and he merely indicated a broom in a tone properly indifferent to its fate. It was war, no doubt, but it appeared strange. As the two boys approached the line, the lieutenant perceived them and swelled with wrath. "Fleming, Wilson, how long does it take you to get water anyhow? Where you been to?" But his oration ceased as he saw their eyes, which were large with great tails. "We're going to charge! We're going to charge!" cried the youth's friend, hastening with his news. "Charge?" said the lieutenant. "Charge? Well, begone! Now this is real fighting!" Over his soiled countenance there went a boastful smile. "Charge? Well, begone!" A little group of soldiers surrounded the two youths. "Are we sure enough?" "Well, I'll be darned. Charge? What for? What it? Wilson, you're lying." "I hope to die," said the youth, pitching his tones to the key of angry remonstrance. "Show we're shooting, I tell you." And his friend spoke in reinforcement. "Not by a blamed sight, he ain't lying. We heard him talking." They caught sight of two mounted figures a short distance from them. One was the colonel of the regiment, and the other was the officer who had received orders from the commander of the division. They were gesticulating at each other. The soldier, pointing at them, interpreted the scene. One man had a final objection. "How could you hear him talking?" But the men, for large part, nodded, admitting that previously the two friends had spoken truth. They settled back into reposeful attitudes, with airs of having accepted the matter, and they mused upon it, with 100 varieties of expression. It was an engrossing thing to think about. Many tightened their belts carefully and hitched at their trousers. A moment later, the officers began to bustle among the men, pushing them into a more compact mass and into better alignment. They chased those that straggled and fumed at a few men who seemed to show by their attitudes that they had decided to remain at that spot. They were like critical shepherds struggling with sheep. Presently, the regiment seemed to draw itself up and heave a deep breath. None of the men's faces were mirrors of large thoughts. The soldiers were bended and stooped like sprinters before a signal. Many pairs of glinting eyes peered from the grimy faces toward the curtains of the deeper woods. They seemed to be engaged in deep calculations of time and distance. They were surrounded by the noises of the monstrous altercation between the two armies. The world was fully interested in other matters. Apparently, the regiment had its small affair to itself. The youth, turning, shot a quick, inquiring glance at his friend. The latter returned to him the same manner of look. They were the only ones who possessed an inner knowledge. Mule drivers, hell to pay. Don't believe many will get back. It was an ironical secret. Still, they saw no hesitation in each other's faces, and they nodded a mute and unprotesting assent when a shaggy man near them said in a meek voice, "He'll get swallowed." That is the end of chapter 18. So as soon as things were starting to look good, well, wouldn't you know it, they built up a little bit of a reputation. And you don't really want to be the nail that sticks up when you're in, line infantry. The attrition is a little high. Just a little. A lot. So, we'll have to see how this charge of theirs shakes out. Whether the mule drivers are going to make it out of this kicking, whether the youth or his friend are going to see the other side of this, or whether they'll be collecting some new red badges of courage of their own. Alright, let's see. Let's go ahead and get through one more chapter before we take a break. This will run a little bit over our normal time, but I'm rather concerned about finishing tonight, so we'll push it if we have to. Alright, chapter 19. The youth stared at the land in front of him. Its foliages now seemed to veil powers and horrors. He was unaware of the machinery of orders that started the charge, although from the corners of his eyes he saw an officer, who looked like a boy a horseback, come galloping, waving his hat. Suddenly he felt a straining and heaving among the men. The line fell slowly forward, like a toppling wall, and, with a convulsive gasp that was intended for a cheer, the regiment began its journey. The youth was pushed and jostled for a moment before he understood the movement at all, but directly he lunged ahead and began to run. He fixed his eye upon a distant and prominent clump of trees, where he had concluded the enemy were to be met, and he ran toward it as toward a goal. He had believed throughout that it was a mere question of getting over an unpleasant matter as quickly as possible, and he ran desperately, as if pursued for a murder. Kind of apt. His face was drawn hard and tight with the stress of his endeavor. His eyes were fixed in a lurid glare, and with his soiled and disordered dress, his red and inflamed features surmounted by the dingy rag with its spot of blood, his wildly swinging rifle and banging accoutrements, he looked to be an insane soldier. As the regiment swung from its position out into a cleared space, the woods and thickets before it awakened. Yellow flames leaped toward it from many directions, and the forest made a tremendous objection. The line lurched straight for a moment. Then the right wing swung forward. It, in turn, was surpassed by the left. Afterward, the center careered to the front, till the regiment was a wedge-shaped mass. But an instant later, the opposition of the bushes, trees, and uneven places of the ground split the command and scattered it into detached clusters. The youth, light-footed, was unconsciously in advance. His eyes still kept note of the clump of trees. From all places near it, the clannish yell of the enemy could be heard. The little flames of rifles leaped from it. The song of the bullets was in the air, and the shells snarled among the tree tops. One tumbled directly into the middle of a hurrying group and exploded in crimson fury. There was an instant spectacle of a man, almost over it, throwing up his hands to shield his eyes. Other men, punched by bullets, fell in grotesque agonies. The regiment left a coherent trail of bodies. They had passed into a clearer atmosphere. There was an effect like a revelation in the new appearance of the landscape. Some men, working madly at a battery, were plain to them, and the opposing infantry's lines were defined by the grey walls and fringes of smoke. It seemed to the youth that he saw everything. Each blade of the green grass was bold and clear. He thought that he was aware of every change in the thin, transparent vapor that floated idly in sheets. The brown or grey trunks of the trees showed each roughness of their surfaces, and the men of the regiment, with their starting eyes and sweating faces, running madly or falling as if thrown headlong to queer, heaped-up corpses, all comprehended. His mind took a mechanical but firm impression, so that afterward everything was pictured and explained to him, save why he himself was there. But there was a frenzy made from his furious rush. The men, pitching forward insanely, had burst into cheerings, mob-like and barbaric, but tuned in strange keys that can arouse the dullard and the stoic. It made a mad enthusiasm that, it seemed, would be incapable of checking itself before granite and brass. There was the delirium that encounters despair and death, and is heedless and blind to the odds. It is a temporary but sublime absence of selfishness, and because it was of this order was the reason, perhaps, why the youth wondered, afterward, what reasons he could have had for being there. Presently, the straining pace ate up the energies of the men. As if by agreement, the leaders began to slacken their speed. The volleys directed against them had a seeming wind-like effect. The regiment snorted and blew. Among some solid trees it began to falter and hesitate. The men, staring intently, began to wait for some of the distant walls of smoke to move and disclose to them the scene. Since much of their strength and their breath had vanished, they returned to caution. They were become men again. The youth had a vague belief that he had run miles, and he thought, in a way, that he was now in some new and unknown land. The moment the regiment ceased its advance, the protesting splutter of musketry became a steady roar. Long and accurate fringes of smoke spread out. From the top of a small hill came level belchings of yellow flame that caused an inhuman whistling in the air. The men halted, had an opportunity to see some of their comrades dropping with moans and shrieks. A few lay underfoot, still or wailing. And now, for an instant, the men stood, their rifles slack in their hands, and watched the regiment dwindle. They stared. They appeared dazed and stupid. This spectacle seemed to paralyze them, overcome them with a fatal fascination. They stared woodenly at the sights, and, lowering their eyes, looked from face to face. It was a strange pause, and a strange silence. Then, above the sounds of the outside commotion, arose the roar of the lieutenant. He strode suddenly forth, his infantile features black with rage. "Come on, you fools!" he bellowed. "Come on! You can't stay here! You must come on!" He said more, but much of it could not be understood. He started rapidly forward, with his head turned toward the men. "Come on!" he was shouting. The men stared with blank and yokel-like eyes at him. He was obliged to halt and retrace his steps. He stood then with his back to the enemy and delivered gigantic curses into the face of the men. His body vibrated from the weight and force of his imprecations. He could string oaths with the facility of a maiden who strings beads. The friend of the youth aroused. Lurching suddenly forward and dropping to his knees, he fired an angry shot at the persistent woods. This action awakened the men. They huddled no more like sheep. They seemed suddenly to bethink themselves of their weapons, and at once commenced firing. Belabored by their officers, they began to move forward. The regiment, involved like a cart involved in mud and muddle, started unevenly, with many jolts and jerks. The men stopped every few paces to fire and load, and in this manner moved slowly on from trees to trees. The flaming opposition in their front grew with their advance until it seemed that all forward ways were barred by the thin, leaping tongues, and off to the right an ominous demonstration could sometimes be dimly discerned. The smoke lately generated was in confusing clouds that made it difficult for the regiment to proceed with intelligence. As he passed through each curling mass, the youth wondered what would confront him on the farther side. The command went painfully forward until an open space interposed between them and the lurid lines. Here, crouching and cowering behind some trees, the men clung with desperation, as if threatened by a wave. They looked wild-eyed, and as if amazed at this furious disturbance they had stirred. In the storm there was an ironical expression of their importance. The faces of the men, too, showed a lack of a certain feeling of responsibility for being there. It was as if they had been driven. It was the dominant animal failing to remember in the supreme moments the forceful causes of various superficial qualities. The whole affair seemed incomprehensible to many of them. As they halted thus, the lieutenant again began to bellow profanely. Regardless of the vindictive threats of the bullets, he went about coaxing, berating, and bedamning. His lips, that were habitually in a soft and childlike curve, were now writhed into unholy contortions. He swore by all possible deities. Once, he grabbed the youth by the arm. "Come on, you lunkhead!" He roared. "Come on! We'll all get killed if we stay here! We've only got to get across that plot, and then—" The remainder of his idea disappeared in a blue haze of curses. The youth stretched forth his arm. "Cross there?" His mouth was puckered in doubt and awe. "Certainly! Just cross the lot! We can't stay here!" screamed the lieutenant. He poked his face close to the youth and waved his bandaged hand. "Come on!" Presently he grappled with him, as if for a wrestling bout. It was as if he planned to drag the youth by the ear onto the assault. The private felt a sudden, unspeakable indignation against his officer. He wrenched fiercely and shook him off. "Come on yourself, then," he yelled. There was a bitter challenge in his voice. They galloped together down the regimental front. The friend scrambled after them. In front of the colors, the three men began to bawl. "Come on, come on!" They danced and gyrated like tortured savages. The flag, obedient to these appeals, bended its glittering form and swept toward them. The men wavered in indecision for a moment. And then, the long, wailful cry of the dilapidated regiment surged forward and began its new journey. Over the field went the scurrying mass. It was a handful of men, splattered into the faces of the enemy. Toward it, instantly, sprang the yellow tongues. A vast quantity of blue smoke hung before them. A mighty banging made ears valueless. The youth ran like a madman to reach the woods before a bullet could discover him. He ducked his head low, like a football player. In his haste, his eyes almost closed, and the scene was a wild blur. Pulsating saliva stood at the corners of his mouth. Within him, as he hurled himself forward, was born a love, a despairing fondness for this flag which was near him. It was a creation of beauty and invulnerability. It was a goddess radiant that bended its form with an imperious gesture to him. It was a woman, red and white, hating and loving, that called him with the voice of his hopes. Because no harm could come to it, he endowed it with power. He kept near, as if it could be a saver of lives, and an imploring cry went from his mind. In the mad scramble, he was aware that the color sergeant flinched suddenly, as if struck by a bludgeon. He faltered and then became motionless, save for his quivering knees. He made a spring and a clutch at the pole. At the same instant, his friend grabbed it from the other side. They jerked at it, stout and furious, but the color sergeant was dead, and the corpse would not relinquish his trust. For a moment, there was a grim encounter. The dead man, swinging with bended back, seemed to be obstinately tugging, in ludicrous and awful ways, for the possession of the flag. It was passed in an instant of time. They wrenched the flag furiously from the dead man, and, as they turned again, the corpse swayed forward with bowed head. One arm swung high, and the curved hand fell with heavy protest on the friend's unheeding shoulder. And that brings us to the end of chapter 19. So, things are going poorly. But somehow, the lieutenant, who has been out in front yelling, the youth who has been running in front, the youth's friend who is there, somehow, they've not been shot yet. Through a little bit of, I guess we call it plot armor. We'll go with plot armor. That works for me. But, yes, so, as he's told to run off with his regiment and probably die, he's inspired with a love of the flag. Oh, how patriotic it is. Ugh. Yeah. I guess you find what you can to get yourself through a tough spot. But yeah. There are points in this book, at certain points, you can't really wonder if this is disparaging the idea of this, like, patriotic invulnerability or the burning love of kin and country, or if it's for it. You really don't know, because half the time the kid is thinking like that while being the world's biggest git, and then on the other side, he's an accidental hero. And you're just like, okay, Stephen Crane, which way are you trying to lead us here? I know there's some of both in everyone. And it's all shades of gray. That's why the entire battlefield is covered in this smoke. But, come on. Yeah, definitely waiting for the other shoe to drop. Like, kid's gonna lose a leg or something. Have a terrible amputation. Or the friend is gonna die next to him, and it's gonna be the end of the world. We've still got about 15% of book left. So there's a lot of time yet for things to go terribly, terribly awry. But if we've learned anything in our reading so far, Henrys don't get their just comeuppance. They just don't. Henry David lives on in infamy. This Henry somehow gets back and is not charged with desertion. Henrys have a way of coming out on top despite what they deserve. I have a bad feeling that this one is going to hold true. Damn it, Henry. Alright, let's go ahead and take a short break. We'll be back in just a little bit, where we'll resume from chapter 20. There are only 24 chapters, so we are coming on pretty quickly. That's true. This isn't the author writing fan fiction about himself. This is the author writing Civil War pulp fiction. But honestly, this is better than a lot of pulp books you pick up. Half the time, those are not worth the trees that were cut down for them. So this is, so far, it's at least good prose. Whether or not the story is well put together or believable or anything. Well, actually, it's reasonably believable, but we just don't like Henrys. All right. Let's take a few minutes, top up our drinks, stretch our legs, and we'll be back. We just have a few chapters left to get through tonight. All right, we are back. So, while we're away, I did have a moment to reflect, and I do have to say, the action scenes throughout this book are very well done. The tension is very thick. The uncertainty of what's going to happen, despite knowing that there's, pretty healthy layers of plot armor about things, we know that it's done very well. It's exciting, while still coming across as somewhat believable. So I will give Stephen Crane, the author, his just praise there, because it's certainly an enjoyable book to read, even if there are a few points where you're just like, oh, God, this kid again. Oh. All right, so we've just got a few chapters left, and let's see how things shake out, as presumably this battle is going to come to its conclusion with the book. We'll probably and about coincide that. So, all right, chapter 20. When the two youths turned with the flag, they saw that much of the regiment had crumbled away, and the dejected remnant was coming slowly back. The men, having hurled themselves in projectile fashion, had presently expended their forces. They slowly retreated, with their faces still toward the spluttering woods, and their hot rifles still replying to the din. Several officers were giving orders, their voices keyed to screams. "Where in the hell you going?" The lieutenant was asking in a sarcastic howl, and a red-bearded officer, whose voice of triple brass could plainly be heard, was commanding, "Shoot into 'em! Shoot into 'em! God damn their souls!" There was a melee of screeches, in which the men were ordered to do conflicting and impossible things. The youth and his friend had a small scuffle over the flag. "Give it to me! No, let me keep it!" Each felt satisfied with the other's possession of it, but each felt bound to declare, by an offer to carry the emblem, his willingness to further risk himself. The youth roughly pushed his friend away. The regiment fell back to the stolid trees. There it halted for a moment to blaze at some dark forms that had begun to steal upon its track. Presently, it resumed its march again, curving among the tree trunks. By the time the depleted regiment had again reached the first open space, they were receiving a fast and merciless fire. There seemed to be mobs all about them. The greater part of the men, discouraged, their spirits worn by the turmoil, acted as if stunned. They accepted the pelting of the bullets with bowed and wary heads. It was of no purpose to strive against walls. It was of no use to batter themselves against granite. And from this consciousness, that they had attempted to conquer an unconquerable thing, there seemed to arise a feeling that they had been betrayed. They glowered with bent brows, but dangerously, upon some of the officers, more particularly upon the red-bearded one, who, with the voice of triple brass. However, the rear of the regiment was fringed with men, who continued to shoot irritably at the advancing foes. They seemed resolved to make every trouble. The youthful lieutenant was, perhaps, the last man in the disordered mass. His forgotten back was toward the enemy. He had been shot in the arm. It hung straight and rigid. Occasionally, he would cease to remember it, and be about to emphasize an oath with a sweeping gesture. The multiplied pain caused him to swear with incredible power. The youth went along with slipping, uncertain feet. He kept watchful eyes rearward. A scowl of mortification and rage was upon his face. He had thought of a fine revenge upon the officer who had referred to him and his fellows as mule drivers. But he saw that it could not come to pass. His dreams had collapsed when the mule drivers, dwindling rapidly, had wavered and hesitated on the little clearing, and then had recoiled. And now the retreat of the mule drivers was a march of shame to him. A dagger-pointed gaze from without his blackened face was held toward the enemy. But his greater hatred was riveted upon the man who, not knowing him, had called him a mule driver. When he knew that he and his comrades had failed to do anything in successful ways that might bring the little pangs of a kind of remorse upon the officer, the youth allowed the rage of the baffled to possess him. This cold officer upon a monument, who dropped epithets unconcernedly down, would be finer as a dead man, he thought. So grievous did he think it that he could never possess the secret right to taunt truly in answer. He had pictured red letters of curious revenge. "We are mule drivers, are we?" And now he was compelled to throw them away. He presently wrapped his heart in the cloak of his pride and kept the flag erect. He harangued his fellows, pushing against their chests with his free hand. Sorry, cats are being silly. Thimble wanted Zoe's chair. He's bigger than she is now. He got it. He harangued his fellows, pushing against their chests with his free hand. To those he knew well, he made frantic appeals, beseeching them by name. Between him and the lieutenant, scolding and near to losing his mind with rage, there was felt a subtle fellowship and equality. They supported each other in all manner of hoarse and howling protests. But the regiment was a machine run down. The two men babbled at a forceless thing. The soldiers who had heart to go slowly were continually shaken in their resolves by a knowledge that comrades were slipping with speed back to the lines. It was difficult to think of reputation when others were thinking of skins. Wounded men were left crying on this black journey. The smoke fringes and flames blustered always. The youth, peering once through a sudden rift in a cloud, saw a brown mass of troops, interwoven and magnified until they appeared to be thousands. A fierce-hued flag flashed before his vision. Immediately, as if the uplifting of the smoke had been prearranged, the discovered troops burst into a rasping yell, and 100 flames jetted toward the retreating band. A rolling gray cloud again interposed as the regiment doggedly replied. The youth had to depend again upon his misused ears, which were trembling and buzzing from the melee of the musketry and yells. The way seemed eternal. In the clouded haze, men became panic-stricken with the thought that the regiment had lost its path and was proceeding in a perilous direction. Once the men who headed the wild procession turned and came pushing back against their comrades, screaming that they were being fired upon from points which they had considered to be toward their own lines. At this cry, a hysterical fear and dismay beset the troops. A soldier, who heretofore had been ambitious to make the regiment into a wise little band that would proceed calmly amid the huge appearing difficulties, suddenly sank down and buried his face in his arms with an air of bowing to a doom. From another, a shrill lamentation rang out, filled with profane allusions to a general. Men ran hither and thither, seeking with their eyes roads of escape. With serene regularity, as if controlled by a schedule, bullets buffeted into men. The youth walked stolidly into the midst of the mob, and with his flag in his hands took a stand, as if he expected an attempt to push him to the ground. He unconsciously assumed the attitude of the color-bearer in the fight of the preceding day. He passed over his brow a hand that trembled. His breath did not come freely. He was choking during this small wait for the crisis. His friend came to him. "Well, Henry, this is goodbye. John." "Oh, shut up, you damn fool," replied the youth, and he would not look at the other. The officers labored like politicians to beat the mass into a proper circle to face the menaces. The ground was uneven and torn. The men curled into depressions and fitted themselves snugly behind whatever would frustrate a bullet. The youth noted with vague surprise that the lieutenant was standing mutely with his legs far apart and his sword held in the manner of a cane. The youth wondered what had happened to his vocal organs that he no more cursed. There was something curious in this little intent pause of the lieutenant. It was like a babe which, having wept its fill, raises its eyes and fixes upon a distant toy. He was engrossed in his contemplation, and the soft under lip quivered from self-whispered words. Some lazy and ignorant smoke curled slowly. The men, hiding from the bullets, waited anxiously for it to lift and disclose the plight of the regiment. The silent ranks were suddenly thrilled by the eager voice of the youthful lieutenant bawling out, "Here they come! Right onto us, by God!" His further words were lost in a roar of wicked thunder from the men's rifles. The youth's eyes had instantly turned in the direction indicated by the awakened and agitated lieutenant, and he had seen the haze of treachery disclosing a body of soldiers of the enemy. They were so near that he could see their features. There was a recognition as he looked at the types of faces. Also, he perceived the dim amazement that their uniforms were rather gay in effect, being light gray, accented with a brilliant-hued facing. Too, the clothes seemed new. These troops had apparently been going forward with caution, their rifles held in readiness, when the youthful lieutenant had discovered them, and their movement had been interrupted by the volley from the Blue Regiment. From the moment's glimpse, it was derived that they had been unaware of the proximity of their dark-suited foes, or had mistaken the direction. Almost instantly, they were shut utterly from the youth's sight by the smoke from the energetic rifles of his companions. He strained his vision to learn the accomplishment of the volley. The smoke hung before him. The two bodies of troops exchanged blows in the manner of a pair of boxers. The fast, angry firings went back and forth. The men in blue were intent with the despair of their circumstances, and they seized upon the revenge to be had at close range. Their thunder swelled, loud and valiant. Their curving front bristled with flashes, and the place resounded with the clangor of their ramrods. The youth ducked, dodged for a time, and achieved a few unsatisfactory views of the enemy. There appeared to be many of them, and they were replying swiftly. They seemed moving toward the Blue Regiment, step by step. He seated himself gloomily on the ground with his flag between his knees. As he noted the vicious, wolf-like temper of his comrades, he had a sweet thought that, if the enemy was about to swallow the regimental broom as a large prisoner, it could at least have the consolation going down with bristles forward. But the blows of the antagonists began to grow more weak. Fewer bullets ripped the air, and finally, when the men slackened to learn of the fight, they could see only dark, floating smoke. The regiment lay still and gazed. Presently, some chance whim came to the pestering blur, and it began to coil heavily away. The men saw ground vacant of fighters. It would have been an empty stage if it were not for a few corpses that lay thrown and twisted into fantastic shapes upon the sward. At sight of this tableau, many of the men in blue sprang from behind their covers and made an ungainly dance of joy. Their eyes burned, and a hoarse cheer of elation broke from their dry lips. It had begun to seem to them that events were trying to prove that they were impotent. These little battles had evidently endeavored to demonstrate that the men could not fight well. When, on the verge of submission to these opinions, the small duel had showed them that the proportions were not impossible, and by it they had revenged themselves upon their misgivings and upon the foe. The impetus of enthusiasm was theirs again. They gazed about them with looks of uplifted pride, feeling new trust in the grim, always confident weapons in their hands, and they were men. All right, and that brings us to the end of chapter 20. So, we have the regular ups and downs. Things are getting very bad, and there's a little tinge of hope. And also, those brand new looking uniforms on the Confederates there, that may have been a bunch of fresh recruits, just as new as this regiment was just the day before. Kids killing kids, man. Civil War was nasty. We do not want anything like that ever again. Do not let anybody tell you otherwise. Alright, chapter 21. Presently, they knew that no firing threatened them. All ways seemed once more open to them. The dusty blue lines of their friends were disclosed a short distance away. In the distance, there were many colossal noises, but in all this part of the field, there's a sudden stillness. They perceived that they were free. The depleted band drew a long breath of relief and gathered itself into a bunch to complete its trip. In this last length of journey, the men began to show strange emotions. They hurried with nervous fear. Some who had been dark and unfaltering in their grimmest moments now could not conceal an anxiety that made them frantic. It was, perhaps, that they dreaded to be killed in insignificant ways after the times for proper military deaths had passed. Or, perhaps, they thought it would be too ironical to get killed at the portals of safety. With backward looks of perturbation, they hastened. Did it really censor you just because you said war or fools? YouTube, calm down. Calm down. As they approached their own lines, there was some sarcasm exhibited on the part of a gaunt and bronzed regiment that lay resting in the shade of the trees. Questions were wafted to them. Where the hell have you been? What you coming back for? Why didn't you stay there? Was it warm out there, Sonny? Going home now, boys? One shouted in taunting mimicry. Oh, mother, come quick and look at the soldiers. There was no reply from the bruised and battered regiment, save that one man made broadcast challenges to fistfights, and the red-bearded officer walked rather near and glared in great swashbuckler style at a tall captain in the other regiment. But the lieutenant suppressed the man who wished to fistfight, and the tall captain, flushing at the little fanfare of the red-bearded one, was obliged to look intently at some trees. The youth's tender flesh was deeply stung by these remarks. From under his creased brows he glowered with hate at the mockers. He meditated upon a few revenges. Still, many in the regiment hung their heads in criminal fashion, so that it came to pass that the men trudged with sudden heaviness, as if they bore upon their bended shoulders the coffin of their honor. The youthful lieutenant, recollecting himself, began to mutter softly in black curses. They turned when they arrived at their old position to regard the ground over which they had charged. The youth, in his contemplation, was smitten with a large astonishment. He discovered that the distances as compared with the brilliant measurings of his mind, were trivial and ridiculous. The stolid trees where much had taken place seemed incredibly near. The time, too, now that he reflected, he saw to have been short. He wondered at the number of emotions and events that had been crowded into such little spaces. Elfin thoughts must have exaggerated and enlarged everything he said. It seemed then that there was bitter justice in the speeches of the gaunt and bronzed veterans. He veiled a glance of disdain at his fellows who strewed the ground, choking with dust, red from perspiration, misty-eyed, disheveled. They were gulping at their canteens, fierce to wring every mite of water from them, and they polished their swollen and watery features with coat sleeves and bunches of grass. However, to the youth there was a considerable joy in musing upon his performances during the charge. He had had very little time previously in which to appreciate himself, so that there was now much satisfaction in quietly thinking of his actions. He recalled bits of color that, in the flurry, had stamped themselves unawares upon his engaged senses. As the regiment lay heaving from its hot exertions, the officer who had named them as mule drivers came galloping along the line. He had lost his cap. His tousled hair streamed wildly, and his face was dark with vexation and wrath. His temper was displayed with more clearness by the way in which he managed his horse. He jerked and wrenched savagely at his bridle, stopping the hard-breathing animal with a furious pull near the colonel of the regiment. He immediately exploded in reproaches, which came unbidden to the ears of the men. They were suddenly alert, being always curious about black words between officers. "Oh, thunder, McChesney! What an awful bowl you made of this thing!" began the officer. He attempted low tones, but his indignation caused certain of the men to learn the sense of his words. "What an awful mess you made! Good Lord, man, you stopped about 100 feet this side of a very pretty success. If your men had gone 100 feet farther, you would have made a great charge, but as it is, what a lot of mud diggers you've got anyway." The men, listening with bated breath, now turned their curious eyes upon the colonel. They had a ragamuffin interest in this affair. The colonel was seen to straighten his form and put one hand forth in oratorical fashion. He wore an injured air, as if a deacon had been accused of stealing. The men were wiggling in an ecstasy of excitement, but of a sudden the colonel's manner changed from that of a deacon to that of a Frenchman. He shrugged his shoulders. "Oh, well, General, we went as far as we could," he said calmly. "As far as you could, did you? God!" snorted the other. "Well, that wasn't very far, was it?" he added, with a glance of cold contempt into the other's eyes. "Not very far, I think. You were intended to make a diversion in favor of Whiterside. How well you succeeded your own ears can now tell you." He wheeled his horse and rode stiffly away. The colonel, bidden to hear the jarring noises of an engagement in the woods to the left, broke out in vague damnations. The lieutenant, who had listened with an air of impotent rage to the interview, spoke suddenly in firm and undaunted tones. "I don't care what a man is, whether he's a general or what. If he says the boys didn't put up a good fight out there, he's a damn fool." "Lieutenant," said the colonel severely, "this is my own affair, and I'll trouble you." The lieutenant made an obedient gesture. "All right, Colonel, all right," he said. He sat down with an air of being content with himself. The news that the regiment had been reproached went along the line. For a time the men were bewildered by it. "Good thunder!" they ejaculated, staring at the vanishing form of the general. They conceived it to be a huge mistake. Presently, however, they began to believe that, in truth, their efforts had been called light. The youth could see this conviction weigh upon the entire regiment until the men were like cuffed and cursed animals, but withal rebellious. The friend, with a grievance in his eye, went to the youth. "I wonder what he does want," he said. "He must think we went out there and played marbles. I never see such a man." The youth developed a tranquil philosophy for these moments of irritation. "Ah, well," he rejoined, "he probably didn't see nothing of it at all and got mad as blazes and concluded we were a lot of sheep just 'cause we didn't do what he wanted done. It's a pity old Grandpa Henderson got killed yesterday. He'd have known that we did our best and fought good. It's just our awful luck, that's what." "I should say so," replied the friend. He seemed to be deeply wounded at an injustice. "I should say we did have awful luck. There's no fun fighting for people when everything they do, no matter what, ain't doing right. I have a notion to stay behind next time and let them take care of their old charge and go to the devil with it." The youth spoke soothingly to his comrade. "Well, we both did good. I'd like to see the fool would say we both didn't do as good as we could." "Of course we did," declared the friend stoutly. "And I'd break the fellow's neck if he was as big as a church. But we're all right, anyhow. For I heard one feller say that we two hit the best in the regiment, and they had a great argument about it. Another fella, of course, he'd up and say it was a lie, but he seen all of what was going on, and he never seen us from the beginning to the end. A lot more stuck in and says it wasn't a lie. We did fight like thunder, and they gave us quite a send-off. This is what I can't stand, these everlasting old soldiers tittering and laughing. And then that general, crazy." The youth exclaimed with sudden exasperation, "He's a lunkhead! He makes me mad! I wish he'd come along next time. We'd show him what—" He ceased because several men had come hurrying up. Their faces expressed a bringing of great news. "Ah, Flem, you just ought to heard!" cried one eagerly. "Heard what?" "You just ought to heard," replied the other, and he arranged himself to tell his tidings. The others made an excited circle. "Well, sir, the colonel met your lieutenant right by us. It was the damnedest thing I ever heard. And he says, Mr. Hasbrook, he says, by the way, who was that lad what carried the flag? He says, there, Fleming. What do you think of that? Who was the lad what carried the flag? He says, and the lieutenant, he speaks up right away. That's Fleming. And he's a Jim Hickey. He says right away. What? I say he did. A Jim Hickey. He says, those are his words. He did too. I said he did. If you can tell his story better than I can, go ahead and tell it. Well, then, keep your mouth shut. The lieutenant, he says, he's a Jim Hickey. And the colonel, he says, he is indeed a very good man to have. He kept the flag away to the front. I saw him. He's a good one, says the colonel. You bet, says the lieutenant. And he and a fellow named Wilson was at the head of the charge. And howling like Indians all the time, he says. Head of the charge all the time, he says. A fellow named Wilson, he says. There, Wilson, my boy. Put that in a letter and send it to your mother, okay? A fellow named Wilson, he says. And the colonel, he says. Were they indeed? My sakes, he says. At the head of the regiment, he says. They were, says the lieutenant. My sakes, says the colonel, he says. Well, he says. They deserve to be major generals. That whole paragraph was a mess. Holy shit. So this is like 4 guys all trying to get the same story out at the same time. No breaks, no quotes. It was just jumble of words. The youth and his friends had said, huh? You're lying, Thompson. Oh, go blazes. He never said it. Oh, what a lie, huh? But despite these youthful scoffings and embarrassments, they knew that their faces were deeply flushing from thrills of pleasure. They exchanged a secret glance of joy and congratulation. They speedily forgot many things. The past held no pictures of error and disappointment. They were very happy, and their hearts swelled with grateful affection for the colonel and the youthful lieutenant. And that is the end of chapter 21. And hold on a second. Is this a couple of enlisted men that are happy with and thankful for and like their COs? Excuse me? Okay, now we know this is fiction. All right, we've got 3 chapters left in about 15 minutes. So we are on a bit of a crunch. So let's continue on with chapter 22. When the woods again began to pour forth the dark-hued masses of the enemy, the youth felt serene self-confidence. He smiled briefly when he saw men dodge and duck at the long screechings of shells that were thrown in giant handfuls over them. He stood, erect and tranquil, watching the attack begin against part of the line that made a blue curve along the side of an adjacent hill. His vision being unmolested by smoke from the rifles of his companions, he had opportunities to see parts of the hard fight. It was a relief to perceive at last from whence came some of these noises, which had been roared into his ears. Off a short way, he saw 2 regiments fighting, a little separate battle with 2 other regiments. It was in a cleared space, wearing a set-apart look. They were blazing as if upon a wager, giving and taking tremendous blows. The firings were incredibly fierce and rapid. These intent regiments apparently were oblivious of all larger purposes of war, and were slugging each other as if at a matched game. In another direction, he saw a magnificent brigade going with the evident intention of driving the enemy from a wood. They passed in out of sight, and presently there was a most awe-inspiring racket in the wood. The noise was unspeakable, having stirred this prodigious uproar, and apparently finding it too prodigious. The brigade, after a little time, came marching airily out again with its fine formation in no wise disturbed. There were no traces of speed in its movements. The brigade was jaunty, and seemed to point a proud thumb at the yelling wood. On a slope to the left, there was a long row of guns, gruff and maddened, denouncing the enemy who, down through the woods, were forming for another attack in the pitiless monotony of conflicts. The round red discharges from the guns made a crimson flare and a high, thick smoke. Occasional glimpses could be caught of groups of toiling artillerymen. In the rear of this row of guns stood a house, calm and white, amid bursting shells. A congregation of horses, tied to a long railing, were tugging frenziedly at their bridles. Men were running hither and thither. The detached battle between the 4 regiments lasted for some time. There chanced to be no interference, and they settled their dispute by themselves. They struck savagely and powerfully at each other for a period of minutes, and then the lighter-hued regiments faltered and drew back, leaving the dark blue lines shouting. The youth could see the 2 flags shaking with laughter amid the smoke remnants. Presently there was a stillness, pregnant with meaning. The blue lines shifted and changed a trifle, and stared expectantly at the silent woods and fields before them. The hush was solemn and church-like, save for a distant battery that, evidently unable to remain quiet, sent a faint rolling thunder over the ground. It irritated, like the noises of unimpressed boys. The men imagined that it would prevent their perched ears from hearing the first words of the new battle. Of a sudden, the guns in the slope roared out a message of warning. A spluttering sound had begun in the woods. It swelled with amazing speed until a profound clamor that involved the earth in noises. The splitting crashes swept along the lines until an interminable roar was developed. To those in the midst of it, it became a din fitted to the universe. It was the whirring and thumping of gigantic machinery, complications among the smaller stars. The youth's ears were filled cups. They were incapable of hearing more. On an incline, over which a road wound, he saw wild and desperate rushes of men perpetually backward and forward in riotous surges. These parts of the opposing armies were two long waves that pitched upon each other, madly at dictated points. To and fro they swelled. Sometimes one side by its yells and cheers would proclaim decisive blows, but a moment later the other side would be all yells and cheers. Once the youth saw a spray of light forms go in hound-like leaps toward the waving blue lines. There was much howling, and presently it went away with a vast mouthful of prisoners. Again he saw a blue wave dash with such thunderous force against a gray obstruction that it seemed to clear the earth of it and leave nothing but trampled sod. And always, in their swift and deadly rushes to and fro, the men screamed and yelled like maniacs. Particular pieces of fence or secure positions behind collections of trees were wrangled over, as gold thrones or pearl bedsteads. There were desperate lunges at these chosen spots seemingly every instant, and most of them were bandied like light toys between the contending forces. The youth could not tell from the battle flags flying like crimson foam in many directions which color of cloth was winning. His emaciated regiment bustled forth with undiminished fierceness. When its time came, when assaulted again by bullets, the men burst out in a barbaric cry of rage and pain. They bent their heads in aims and of intent hatred behind the projected hammers of their guns. Their ramrods clanged loud with fury as their eager arms pounded the cartridges into the rifle barrels. The front of the regiment was a smoke wall, penetrated by the flashing points of yellow and red. Wallowing in the fight, they were in an astonishingly short time resmudged. They surpassed in stain and dirt all their previous appearances, moving to and fro with strained exertion. Jabbering all the while, they were, with their swaying bodies, black faces and glowing eyes, like strange and ugly fiends jiggling heavily in the smoke. The lieutenant, returning from a tour after a bandage, produced from a hidden receptacle of his mind new and portentous oaths suited to the emergency. Strings of expletives he swung lash-like over the backs of his men, and it was evident that his previous efforts had in no wise impaired his resources. The youth, still the bearer of the colors, did not feel his idleness. He was deeply absorbed as a spectator. The crash and swing of the great drama made him lean forward, intent-eyed, his face working in small contortions. Sometimes he prattled, words coming unconsciously from him in grotesque exclamations. He did not know that he breathed, that the flag hung silently over him, so absorbed was he. A formidable line of the enemy came within dangerous range. They could be seen plainly, tall, gaunt men with excited faces running with long strides toward a wandering fence. At sight of this danger, the men suddenly ceased their cursing monotone. There was an instant of strained silence before they threw up their rifles and fired a plumping volley at the foes. There had been no order given. The men, upon recognizing the menace, had immediately let drive their flock of bullets without waiting for word of command. But the enemy were quick to gain the protection of the wandering line of fence. They slid down behind it with remarkable celerity, and from this position they began briskly to slice up the blue men. These latter braced their energies for a great struggle. Often, white clenched teeth shone from the dusky faces. Many heads surged to and fro, floating upon a pale sea of smoke. Those behind the fence frequently shouted and yelped in taunts and jibe-like cries, but the regiment maintained a stressed silence. Perhaps at this new assault, the men recalled the fact that they had been named mud diggers, and it made their situation thrice bitter. They were breathlessly intent upon keeping the ground and thrusting away the rejoicing body of the enemy. They fought swiftly and with a despairing savageness denoted in their expressions. The youth had resolved not to budge, whatever should happen. Some arrows of scorn that had buried themselves in his heart had generated strange and unspeakable hatred. It was clear to him that his final and absolute revenge was to be achieved by his dead body lying torn and gluttering upon the field. This was to be a poignant retaliation upon the officer who had said mule drivers and later mud diggers. For in all the wild graspings of his mind for a unit responsible for his sufferings and commotions, he always seized upon the man who had dubbed him wrongly. And it was his idea, vaguely formulated, that his corpse would be for those eyes a great and salt reproach. The regiment bled extravagantly. Grunting bundles of blue began to drop. The orderly sergeant of the youth's company was shot through the cheeks. Its support being injured, his jaw hung far down, disclosing in the wide cavern of the mouth a pulsing mass of blood and teeth. And with it all, he made attempts to cry out. In his endeavor there was a dreadful earnestness, as if he conceived that one great shriek would make him well. The youth saw him presently go rearward. His strength seemed in no wise impaired. He ran swiftly, casting wild glances for succor. Others fell down about the feet of their companions. Some of the wounded crawled out and away, but many lay still, their bodies twisted into impossible shapes. The youth looked once for his friend. He saw a vehement young man, powder-smeared and frowzled, whom he knew to be him. The lieutenant also was unscathed in his position at the rear. He had continued to curse, but it was now with the air of a man who was using his last box of oaths. For the fire of the regiment had begun to wane and dip. The robust voice that had come strangely from the thin ranks was growing rapidly weak. That is the end of chapter 22. So, we are very quickly approaching the end, and things are looking quite grim here. There are fewer and fewer of the men left. Somehow the lieutenant it seems like he's only been wounded by, he had one shot in the arm, and then in the opening skirmish, way back 2 days ago, had a bullet through the hand, so he's probably not terribly useful in a fight, but he seems to be holding up pretty well. And the loud soldier, the youth's friend, William, is still kicking, still doing his best. So the lads are around. Of course, Henry has been the the flag bearer for a little while. So not so much fighting, but that is a dangerous position to be in. You are saying, hey, look at me, I dare you to shoot me, sort of deal. So, I'll not fault him for actually not holding a gun there. Alright, let's continue on. We've got 2 chapters left. We are going to run over tonight, but we will finish this damn book. Chapter 23. The colonel came running along the back of the line. There were other officers following him. "We must charge him!" they shouted. "We must charge him!" They cried with resentful voices, as if anticipating rebellion against this plan by the men. The youth, upon hearing the shouts, began to study the distance between him and the enemy. He made vague calculations. He saw that to be firm soldiers they must go forward. It would be death to stay in the present place. And with all the circumstances, to go backward would exalt too many others. Their hope was to push the galling foes away from the fence. He expected that his companions, wary and stiffened, would have to be driven to this assault. But as he turned toward them, he perceived with a certain surprise that they were giving quick and unqualified expressions of assent. There was an ominous, clanging overture to the charge, when the shafts of the bayonets rattled upon the rifle barrels. At the yelled words of command, the soldiers sprang forward in eager leaps. There was new and unexpected force in the movement of the regiment. A knowledge of its faded and jaded condition made the charge appear like a paroxysm, a display of the strength that comes before a final feebleness. The men scampered in insane fever of haste, racing as if to achieve a sudden success before an exhilarating fluid should leave them. It was a blind and despairing rush by the collection of men in dusty and tattered blue, over a green sward and under a sapphire sky, toward a fence, dimly outlined in smoke, from behind which sputtered the fierce rifles of enemies. The youth kept the bright colors to the front. He was waving his free arm in furious circles, while shrieking mad calls and appeals, urging on those that did not need to be urged, for it seemed that the mob of blue men hurling themselves on the dangerous group of rifles were again grown suddenly wild with an enthusiasm of unselfishness. From the many firings starting toward them, it looked as if they would merely succeed in making a great sprinkling of corpses on the grass between their former position and the fence. But they were in a state of frenzy, perhaps because of forgotten vanities, and it made an exhibition of sublime recklessness. There was no obvious questioning, nor figurings, nor diagrams. There was apparently no considered loopholes. It appeared that the swift wings of their desires would have shattered against the iron gates of the impossible. He himself felt the daring spirit of a savage, religion mad. He was capable of profound sacrifices, a tremendous death. He had no time for dissections, but he knew that he thought of the bullets only as things that could prevent him from reaching the place of his endeavor. There were subtle flashings of joy within him that thus should be his mind. He strained all his strength. His eyesight was shaken and dazzled by the tension of thought and muscle. He did not see anything excepting the mist of smoke gashed by the little knives of fire, but he knew that in it lay the aged fence of a vanished farmer, protecting the snuggled bodies of the gray men. As he ran, a thought of the shock of contact gleamed in his mind. He expected a great concussion when the two bodies of troops crashed together. This became a part of his wild battle madness. He could feel the onward swing of the regiment about him as he conceived of a thunderous, crushing blow that would prostrate the resistance and spread consternation and amazement for miles. The flying regiment was going to have a catapultian effect. This dream made him run faster among his comrades, who were giving vent to hoarse and frantic cheers. But presently, he could see that many of the men in gray did not intend to abide the blow. The smoke rolling disclosed men who ran. Their faces still turned. These grew to a crowd who retired stubbornly. Individuals wheeled frequently to send a bullet at the blue wave. But at one point of the line, there was a grim and obdurate group that made no movement. They were settled firmly down behind posts and rails. A flag, ruffled and fierce, waved over them, and their rifles dinned fiercely. The blue whirl of men got very near, until it seemed that in truth there would be a close and frightful scuffle. There was an expressed disdain in the opposition of the little group that changed the meaning of the cheers of the men in blue. They became yells of wrath, directed, personal. The cries of the two parties were now in sound, an interchange of scathing insults. They in blue showed their teeth. Their eyes shone all white. They launched themselves at the throats of those who stood resisting. The space between dwindled to an insignificant distance. The youth had centered the gaze of his soul upon that other flag. Its possession would be high pride. It would express bloody minglings, near blows. He had a gigantic hatred for those who had made great difficulties and complications. They caused it to be as a craved treasure of mythology, hung amid tasks and contrivances of danger. He plunged like a mad horse at it. He was resolved it should not escape if wild blows and darings of blows could seize it. His own emblem, quivering into flare, was winging toward the other. It seemed there would shortly be an encounter of strange beaks and claws as of eagles. The swirling body of blue men came to a sudden halt at a close and disastrous range and roared a swift volley. The group in gray was split and broken by this fire, but its riddled body still fought. The men in blue yelled again and rushed in upon it. The youth, in his leapings, saw, as through a mist, a picture of 4 or 5 men stretched upon the ground or writhing upon their knees with bowed heads as if they had been stricken by bolts from the sky. Tottering among them was the rival color-bearer, whom the youth saw had been bitten vitally by the bullets of the last formidable volley. He perceived this man fighting a last struggle, the struggle of one whose legs are grasped by demons. It was a ghastly battle. Over his face was the bleach of death, but set upon it was the dark and hard lines of desperate purpose. With this terrible grin of resolution, he hugged his precious flag to him and was stumbling and staggering in his design to go the way that led to safety for it. But his wounds always made it seem that his feet were retarded, held, and he fought a grim fight, as with invisible ghouls fastened greedily upon his limbs. Those in advance of the scampering blue men, howling cheers, leaped at the fence. The despair of the lost was in his eyes as he glanced back at them. The youth's friend went over the obstruction in a tumbling heap and sprang at the flag as a panther at prey. He pulled at it and, wrenching it free, swung up its red brilliancy with a mad cry of exultation, even as the color-bearer, gasping, lurched over in a final throw, and, stiffening convulsively, turned his dead face to the ground. There was much blood upon the grass blades. At the place of success, there began more wild clamorings of cheers. The men gesticulated and bellowed in an ecstasy. When they spoke, it was as if they considered their listener to be a mile away. What hats and caps were left to them, they often slung high into the air. At one part of the line, 4 men had been swooped upon, and they now sat as prisoners. Some blue men were about them in an eager and curious circle. The soldiers had trapped strange birds, and there was an examination. A flurry of fast questions was in the air. One of the prisoners was nursing a superficial wound in the foot. Cuddled it, baby-wise, but he looked up from it often to curse with an astonishing, utter abandon straight at the noses of his captors. He consigned them to red regions. He called upon the pestilential wrath of strange gods, and with it all he was singularly free from recognition of the finer points of the conduct of prisoners of war. It was as if a clumsy clod had trod upon his toe, and he conceived it to be his privilege, his duty, to use deep, resentful oaths. Another, who was a boy in years, took his plight with great calmness and apparent good nature. He conversed with the men in blue, studying their faces with his bright and keen eyes. They spoke of battles and conditions. There was an acute interest in all their faces during this exchange of viewpoints. It seemed a great satisfaction to hear voices from where all had been darkness and speculation. The third captive sat with a morose countenance. He preserved a stoical and cold attitude. To all advances he made one reply without variation: "Ah, go to hell!" The last of the 4 was always silent, and, for the most part, kept his face turned in unmolested directions. From the views the youth received, he seemed to be in a state of absolute dejection. Shame was upon him, and with it profound regret that he was, perhaps, no more to be counted in the ranks of his fellows. The youth could detect no expression that would allow him to believe that the other was giving a thought to his narrowed future. The pictured dungeons, perhaps, and starvations and brutalities, liable to the imagination. All to be seen was shame for captivity, and regret for the right to antagonize. After the men had celebrated sufficiently, they settled down behind the old rail fence, on the opposite side to the one from which their foes had been driven. A few shot perfunctorily at distant marks. There was some long grass. The youth nestled in it and rested, making a convenient rail support the flag. His friend, jubilant and glorified, holding his treasure with vanity, came to him there. They sat side by side and congratulated each other. All right, that is the end of chapter 23. We've got just one chapter left. We are a little over in time, but it's only three pages. Hang with us. We're almost there. The roarings that had stretched in a long line of sound across the face of the forest began to grow intermittent and weaker. The stentorian speeches of the artillery continued in some distant encounter, but the crashes of the musketry had almost ceased. The youth and his friend of a sudden looked up, feeling a deadened form of distress at the waning of these noises, which had become a part of life. They could see the changes going on among the troops. There were marchings this way and that way. A battery wheeled leisurely. On the crest of a small hill was the thick gleam of many departing muskets. The youth arose. "Well, what now, I wonder?" he said. But by his tone he seemed to be preparing to resent some new monstrosity in the way of dins and smashes. He shaded his eyes with his grimy hand and gazed over the field. His friend also arose and stared. "I bet we're going to get along out of this and back over the river," said he. "Well, I swan," said the youth. They waited, watching. Within a little while, the regiment received orders to retrace its way. The men got up, grunting from the grass, regretting the soft repose. They jerked their stiffened legs and stretched their arms over their heads. One man swore as he rubbed his eyes. They all groaned. "Oh, Lord!" They had as many objections to this change as they would have had to a proposal for a new battle. They trampled slowly back over the field, across which they had run in a mad scamper. The regiment marched until it had joined its fellows. The reformed brigade, in column, aimed through a wood at the road. Directly, they were in a mass of dust-covered troops, and were trudging along in a way parallel to the enemy's lines, as these had been defined by the previous turmoil. They passed within view of a stolid white house, and saw, in front of it, groups of their comrades, lying in wait behind a neat breastwork. A row of guns were booming at a distant enemy. Shells thrown in reply were raising clouds of dust and splinters. Horsemen dashed along the line of entrenchments. At this point of its march, the division curved away from the field and went winding off in the direction of the river. When the significance of this movement had impressed itself upon the youth, he turned his head and looked over his shoulder toward the trampled and debris-strewn ground. He breathed a breath of new satisfaction. He finally nudged his friend. "Well, it's all over," he said to him. His friend gazed backward. "But God it is," he assented. They mused. For a time, the youth was obliged to reflect in a puzzled and uncertain way. His mind was undergoing a subtle change. It took moments for it to cast off its battleful ways and resume its accustomed course of thought. Gradually, his brain emerged from the clogged clouds, and, at last, he was enabled to more closely comprehend himself and circumstance. He understood then that the existence of shot and countershot was in the past. He had dwelt in a land of strange, squalling upheavals, and had come forth. He had been where there was red of blood and black of passion, and he was escaped. His first thoughts were given to rejoicings at this fact. Later, he began to study his deeds, his failures, and his achievements. Thus, fresh from scenes where many of his usual machines of reflections had been idle, from where he had proceeded sheep-like, he struggled to marshal all his acts. At last, they marched before him clearly. From this present viewpoint, he was enabled to look upon them in spectator fashion and criticize them with some correctness. For his new condition had already defeated certain sympathies. Regarding his procession of memory, he felt gleeful and unregretting, for in it his public deeds were paraded in great and shining prominence. Those performances, which had been witnessed by his fellows, marched now in wide purple and gold, having various deflections. They went gaily with music. It was pleasure to watch these things. He spent delightful minutes viewing the gilded images of memory. He saw that he was good. He recalled with a thrill of joy the respectful comments of his fellows upon his conduct. Nevertheless, the ghost of his flight from the first engagement appeared to him and danced. There were small shoutings in his brain about these matters. For a moment he blushed, and the light of his soul flickered with shame. A specter of reproach came to him. There loomed the dogging memory of the tattered soldier, he who, gored by bullets and faint of blood, had fretted concerning an imagined wound in another. He who had loaned his last of strength and intellect for the tall soldier he who, blind with weariness and pain, had been deserted in the field. For an instant, a wretched chill of sweat was upon him at the thought that he might be detected in the thing. As he stood persistently before his vision, he gave vent to a cry of sharp irritation and agony. His friend turned. "What's the matter, Henry?" he demanded. The youth's reply was an outburst of crimson oaths. As he marched along the little branch-hung roadway among his prattling companions, this vision of cruelty brooded over him. It clung near him always, and darkened his view of these deeds in purple and gold. Whichever way his thoughts turned, they were followed by the somber phantom of the desertion in the fields. He looked stealthily at his companions, feeling sure that they must discern in his face evidences of this pursuit. But they were plotting in ragged array, discussing with quick tongues the accomplishments of the late battle. Oh, if a man should come up and ask me, I'd say we got a dumb good licking. Licking in your eye? We ain't licked, sonny. We're going down here anyways. Swing round and come in behind me. Oh, hush with your coming in behind him. I've seen all I wanna. Don't tell me about coming in behind. Bill Smithers, he says he'd rather been in 1,000 battles than been in that hell of a hospital. He says they got shooting in the nighttime. The shells drop plumb among 'em in the hospital. He says sich hollering he never see. Hasbrook? He's the best officer in this here regiment. He's a whale. Didn't I tell you we'd come around behind him? Didn't I tell you so? Oh, shut your mouth. For a time, this pursuing recollection of the tattered man took all elation from the youth's veins. He saw his vivid error. He was afraid that it would stand before him all his life. He took no share in the chatter of his comrades, nor did he look at them or know them, save when he felt sudden suspicion that they were seeing his thoughts and scrutinizing each detail of the scene with the tattered soldier. Yet, gradually, he mustered force to put the sin at a distance, and at last, his eyes seemed to open to some new ways. He found that he could look back upon the brass and bombast of his earlier Gospels and see them truly. He was gleeful when he discovered that he now despised them. With this conviction came a store of assurance. He felt a quiet manhood, not assertive, but of sturdy and strong blood. He knew that he would no more quail before his guides wherever they should point. He had been to touch the great death and found that, after all, it was but the great death. He was a man. So it came to pass that, as he trudged from place of blood and wrath, his soul changed. He came from hot plowshares to prospects of clover tranquility. And it was as if hot plowshares were not. Scars faded as flowers. It rained. The procession of weary soldiers became a bedraggled train, despondent and muttering, marching with churning effort in a trough of liquid brown mud under a low, wretched sky. Yet, the youth smiled, for he saw that the world was a world for him, though many discovered it to be made of oaths and walking sticks. He had rid himself of the red sickness of battle. The sultry nightmare was in the past. He had been an animal blistered and sweating in the heat and pain of war. He turned now, with a lover's thirst, to images of tranquil skies, fresh meadows, cool brooks, an existence of soft and eternal peace. Over the river, a golden ray of sun came through the hosts of leaden rain clouds. The end. So, that was pretty good, honestly. I still, even through all of it, Henry's kind of a dick. It happens. But it was a nice little exploration of what courage is, what striving through adversity like that is, what the sort of experience at the ground can be when you're in the sort of struggle that is way, way bigger than one person. It describes the horrors of war at the ground level really, really well. Even if there is a liberal use of plot armor here for the core characters. It's like shonen anime levels of plot armor going on. But I'll give it a pass. I'll give that a little bit of an overlooking. It was interesting. It was well written, and it was a good exploration of the emotional circumstances and the growth of the character through the span of like 2 days. So you grow up fast and more. I get it. It was also nice. I liked and appreciated that this was just a battle. It never really, as it said, what battle it is. It wasn't like the first or the last battle. It was just a battle. It adds a lot of futility to everything. It's like, if it had been revealed that this was like Appomattox or like Gettysburg, one of the big ones, you're just like, oh, they made a huge victory, or like if something huge happened, is momentous. No, it was just a battle. It went both ways for a while, wins and losses, but it was just one clash in the entire conflict. The boy wasn't a hero of the war. He wasn't anything. It's just there. And yeah, you're right. It reinforces the banality of everything. It's It's not something to be glorified. Yes, growth and development can come through it, but at the end of the day, it's not something to strive for. It's something to be avoided, to not have these people having to go through this sort of terror. So, I think that's a good way to look at it, is while Stephen Crane wasn't really trying to, he wasn't glorifying war, but he also wasn't like deriding the soldiers or anyone that fought or the motivations. So he was making it all very human. But at the same time, he didn't paint them as saints and heroes and like things to be admired. Just people. Didn't demonize them, but he didn't put them on a pedestal either. And that's really hard to find sometimes. Because a lot of times when you're dealing with this, you either get on, you get an author or someone who is on one side or other of an issue, or one side or other of history, and they're trying to push their own viewpoint. And that's fine. Everyone's entitled to viewpoints. But it is pretty rare in this case to get a very flat representation. It's not hawkish or dovish. It is just, this is what it's like. This is what I wrote, what he wrote it as. And it's a pretty good depiction of it. So, that's probably why this is held on for so long. Why this is so well remembered. Because this is one of those books that is pretty timeless. You see it referenced pretty regularly, both in military folks and very non-military folks. Yeah, exactly. It doesn't matter which side you're on. He barely even referenced which side Henry was on. Yes, we knew Henry was Union and was fighting against the Rebs, but I mean, he really you referenced the colors. That was all he really got to. So it stripped away a lot of the why, the how, or the why and the reasons and the rationale and justifications, and just got into the nitty-gritty of the how, the who, and the internal and external struggles. Yeah, we know more by the uniforms than anything else. So you could take it completely out of context, or take it out of an American context. Someone that is not USA-centric could read this and have very little understanding of what the context of this was, just aside from two groups fighting. That's all you really need to know. It's a big conflict. It's a war. So, I did enjoy that. I will continue to dog on Henry. I think he's still our favorite Henry. But there was a stretch there. There was a stretch where he was losing ground. It was way closer than it had any right to be in about the 2/3 of the way through. Yeah, that's the what, the where, and the how are more real than the why. The why is irrelevant to a lot of folks. The why is irrelevant to a lot of folks. It doesn't matter how far away from conflict you are, which is another conversation entirely. Alright guys, we are way over in time tonight, but I had a good time with this one. It was a fun reading. It was a good book. It had a good tension. It was a good exploration of both action and the internal and external conflicts and the personal growth of our currently front runner for favorite Henry. We gotta find some more Henrys. There's gotta be good Henrys out there. There has to be. Has to be. We'll find it. We'll find one, I swear on everything. Alright, guys. Let's go ahead and call it here for the night. We've got probably enough time for one more good book in before we want to transition to before we shift over to our Thanksgiving project. So we've got a little bit of, we've got some open-endedness, because so if we can find something, if anyone has anything that they'd like to read, anything they'd like to put me through to suffer with, anything along those lines, I will even take something with French against protestations. I will have it known, I looked at Les Mis. Holy shit, is Les Mis long. Wow, is it long. So I'm not thinking that's going to play out for a little while. Or if we ever get to it, we'll have to split it up into different different stretches. But yeah, so as always, we've got a couple days here. So if anyone has any suggestions, and I'll put the request out to Bluesky as well, feel free to drop them in. I love to try things that I wouldn't normally select for myself. I kind of look at the most recent popular downloads on Gutenberg, and we'll see there. Yeah. You say that, but there's a couple of them that I do pretty regularly on karaoke nights. Yep. Yeah. I am what I am. I do a pretty mean Javert. So, alright guys, that is what we're going to wrap up with tonight, and we will be back on Friday. I don't know yet what we're going to be reading, but that's part of the charm, right? We'll find out together. Or, you'll find out shortly after I find out, because I do have to select the book and make a thumbnail and put the post up. Anyway, details. Alright guys, I've kept you well longer than I normally intended to, so we'll go ahead and wrap up here. I hope everyone had a good time with this book, and will join us next time. Until then, have a wonderful night, and bye now.